The old man stood in the rain outside the seventh garage that week, clutching a folder of rejection after rejection, and for the first time in 40 years, he wondered if his father's dream had finally died with the engine sitting silent in his driveway. 6 mechanics had already turned him away. 6 men had looked at that battered, rust-streaked Jaguar E-Type and shaken their heads, telling him the same thing every time: it's too far gone, it's not worth saving, let it go. But Richard Ashford could not let it go. That car was the last thing his father had ever touched with his own hands before he passed, and somewhere underneath the broken engine and the peeling paint, there was a promise Richard had made at his father's bedside, a promise he intended to keep, no matter how many doors closed in his face. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that kindness and determination can still change a life, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me you're watching, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and make sure you're subscribed to Kindness Corner, because stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists. Richard was 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher with steady hands and a heart heavier than it had been in years. His father, Thomas Ashford, had spent 30 years as a machinist, and in his spare time, he had poured every ounce of his patience into restoring that Jaguar, piece by piece, weekend after weekend, in a garage that smelled of oil and sawdust. Richard remembered being a boy, sitting on an overturned bucket, watching his father's hands move with a kind of reverence over the engine, as if he were healing something rather than fixing it. His father used to say that a car like this one wasn't just metal and wire, it was a story, and every story deserved an ending worth telling. When his father grew too old and too sick to finish the restoration, he made Richard promise one thing: don't let her die in the garage. Finish what I started. Richard had promised, not fully understanding then how heavy that promise would become. For 2 years after his father's funeral, the Jaguar sat untouched, a monument to grief Richard wasn't ready to face. But grief has a way of turning into resolve, and eventually Richard decided the time had come. He started calling around, visiting garage after garage, each time carrying photographs of what the car used to look like, each time explaining what it meant to him. And each time, he was met with the same tired excuses. The frame is too rusted. The parts are obsolete. It would cost more to fix than it's worth. One mechanic didn't even bother to look under the hood before waving him off. Another laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively, and told him to sell it for scrap and buy something newer. By the 6th rejection, Richard sat in his car outside the garage, gripping the steering wheel, feeling something inside him break just a little. He wasn't just losing a car. He felt like he was losing his father all over again. It was late on a Thursday afternoon, the sky bruised with rain clouds, when Richard pulled into one last garage on the edge of town, a small operation with peeling signage and a single mechanic named Marcus Bell sweeping up at the end of his shift. Richard almost didn't stop. He had convinced himself this would be rejection number 7, another polite dismissal, another drive home in silence. But something made him park the car anyway. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the last flicker of his father's stubbornness living inside him. He walked up to Marcus, who was maybe 30 years old, his coveralls stained with the honest wear of real work, and Richard braced himself for the same tired words he had heard 6 times before. Marcus listened. That was the first difference Richard noticed. Marcus actually listened. He didn't glance at his watch or interrupt. He asked Richard to describe the car, and when Richard mentioned it was a Jaguar E-Type that had belonged to his father, something shifted in Marcus's expression. He asked if he could see it. Richard, hardly daring to hope, led him outside to where the Jaguar sat on the flatbed trailer, its navy paint dulled by 2 years of dust, its chrome grille tarnished but still elegant, like an old photograph of someone who used to be beautiful. Marcus circled the car slowly, running his hand along the hood the way Richard remembered his own father doing decades earlier. He crouched down, checked the frame, looked under the hood, and was quiet for a long moment. Richard's chest tightened, certain the answer was coming, certain it would be no again. Instead, Marcus stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and said something Richard would never forget: "This car isn't dead, it's just been waiting for someone who wasn't afraid of the work." He explained that yes, the restoration would take time, yes, it would take patience, and yes, some parts would be difficult to source. But difficult wasn't the same as impossible, and he told Richard that any car that had survived this long deserved the chance to be brought back to life. Richard, standing in the gathering dusk, felt tears he hadn't allowed himself to cry in months finally slip down his face. It wasn't just that someone had said yes. It was that someone had finally understood what the car actually meant. Over the following months, Richard visited that small garage nearly every week. He watched as Marcus stripped away the rust with the same careful reverence his father once had, sourced parts from salvage yards 3 states away, and rebuilt the engine piece by piece, refusing every shortcut, refusing every excuse to cut corners. There were setbacks, a cracked cylinder head that took weeks to replace, an electrical system that fought back at every turn, but Marcus never once suggested giving up. He would call Richard some evenings just to tell him about small victories, a bolt that finally loosened, a part that had arrived after weeks of searching, and slowly, Richard began to feel his father's presence again, not as grief, but as something warmer, something like pride. The day the restoration was finished, Richard stood in that same garage, now golden with afternoon light, and watched Marcus turn the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life, steady and strong, filling the space with a sound Richard hadn't heard since he was a boy sitting on that bucket. He pressed his hand to his chest, overwhelmed, and Marcus stepped back, letting the moment belong entirely to Richard. In that instant, it wasn't just a car that had been restored. It was a promise kept, a legacy honored, and proof that sometimes it only takes one person who refuses to give up on something everyone else has written off. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness and persistence still matter in this world. Before we go, I'd love for you to comment the word legacy below if you believe some things are always worth saving. Richard drives that Jaguar every single week now, top down, wind in his hair, his father's voice somehow still riding beside him in every mile, a reminder that love, once built, never truly disappears, it simply waits for someone brave enough to bring it home.